But we are going to look at Esther, and I know you probably may be familiar with the story, but we're going to hover over chapters 1 and 2 of Esther today. There's just so much, I can't read all of the text, but I'm going to pull out some texts. Let me see. Let's look at, well, let me just walk you through. It begins with King Ahasuerus. I don't know that I'm saying that right. If anybody has a better pronunciation, let me know. Who is ruler of the kingdom. And he has the Jews, or the Israelites, in exile. And they have been there for quite a while. They are, previous to this, Jeremiah had told them, the prophet, to settle down, raise families, have babies. And he gave them that famous text, for God has a plan for you, for future and a hope. So that even though they messed up time and time again, God has sent somebody every time to say, God still loves you, God's still at work. So the title of this sermon is a book of providence. That Esther is about the providence of God. Can anybody tell me what the word providence means? Anybody?
Is it wisdom?
It can be God providing wisdom, but what's God's providence? So it's when God provides. Yeah. God's providence is evident when you see him paving a way, when you see him putting you in a place, and you may not even realize that God got you to a place because of his providence. Now, the reason I say that is because God is not mentioned in the book of Esther. But it is clear that God's providence was working, because the things that happened, Mordecai, her uncle, and the things that happened to her could only be explained by the providence of God. And so when you are going through a tough time and you're wondering where's God and it feels like you're by yourself, you can know that God is working providentially. What does our thing say at the end? You go nowhere by accident. Wherever you go, God is sending you. Wherever you are, God has put you there. That is providence. Now, just fun fact, Providence, Rhode Island was named by a man called Roger Williams. Does anybody know what Roger Williams' claim to fame was? Oh, good, I get to tell you. You know Frank?
Is this the same Roger Williams was kicked out of the church?
Yeah, kicked out of the state church and went to, in Massachusetts, he was a real pain. He was a real pain, and he, they fled England because they didn't want to be ruled over by a state church. And he felt like the state church, anytime the church and God got together, God's people ended up being corrupted by the state. He really felt like you couldn't blend government and church because the church wasn't free to be prophetic. Well, he preached that in the 1600s in Massachusetts and kind of got kicked out. And so he moved up into the wilderness of what we now know as Rhode Island, and had a house church. And I'm really condensing this story.
Yeah.
But long story short, he and a couple other folks ended up founding the first Baptist Church in America, which is in Providence, Rhode Island. And they named Providence because of the whole idea that God was providing for them. And he was against slavery. He also thought that they were mistreating the Indians, the Native Americans, and he felt like they needed to be human and pay them for their land and treat them like citizens or people. And boy, that didn't win any friends or influence people. So when he did buy the land for the church and plantation, he paid them a fair price. He also was a very, very early abolitionist. who preached against slavery. So long story short, if you go to the First Baptist Church of America, it's was the physical building that's there now was built in the early 1700s. Now, people don't know that Baptists were formed because of religious freedom and the idea of separation of church and state. We believe that the church needs to be a powerful voice and a prophetic voice. And what happened is the folks came from England and they just wanted to create another Church of England here. So, a little bit of history in my family. I've always been told that the first pastor after Roger Williams was Chad Brown of Brown University, which is right there. The First Baptist Church of America is on the campus of Brown University. My relatives are Brown, and I'm supposed to be related to that family. So
that's where Mark Donahue went to school.
Really?
Everybody knows who Mark Donahue is.
Who is Mark Donahue?
He was the first driver of Roger Penske's to
Oh,
ever
cool.
win the 500.
So Baptists have a real history in the American story. All that to say, Providence, God's working things out when we can't see it. I don't think Esther and Mordecai were fully aware of what was happening, but they were open and willing and trusting. So look in chapter 2. So the king got really drunk one night. Well, he had 6 months of parties, believe it or not, 6 months of parties, and he invited all the important people from around the region to come and see all of his wealth and for him to show off. And in the middle of one of those parties, he invited his current wife, Queen Vashti, to come and parade herself in front of all these males, and she said no. Because we're not sure, maybe she just didn't want to be paraded in front of those males, which was against her religion and her belief. And he was drunk, and it put him in a position of, in front of all those leaders, of having somebody not do what he says. And so immediately he had her exiled and declared that she was not queen anymore, which he could have had her killed, but she was exiled. So he was without a queen. Over the course of time, he began to say, hey, let's have all the young women come in and let me pick another queen. Let's bring a bunch of women into my harem. Yeah, there was a harem. Back then, the whole idea of sexual slavery and the things that we think are terrible was kind of a part of their culture. So Esther finds herself, she's very beautiful. She hides the fact that she's Jewish, and she finds herself in the king's harem. Let's start with chapter 2, verse 7. Mordecai, who was high up in the government, had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his cousin, for she had neither father nor mother. The girl was fair and beautiful, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai adopted her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed to exile his wife and that he wanted to pick a new one, and when many young women were gathered in the citadel of Susa in custody of Hegai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Hegai, who had charge of the woman. The girl pleased him and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with cosmetic treatments and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen maids from the king's palace, and advanced her and her maids to the best place in the harem. Esther did not reveal her people or kindred, for Mordecai had charged her not to tell. Every day Mordecai would walk around in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and how she fared. The turn came for each girl to go into King Ahasuerus. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but you get it. After being 12 months under the regulations for the women. 12 months of cosmetic treatments. Mercy. Since this was the regular period of their cosmetic treatment, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with perfumes and cosmetics for women. When the girl went in to the king, she was given whatever she asked for to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she went in. Then in the morning she came back to the second harem in custody of Shagaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She did not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her, and she was summoned by name. Now, Esther was put in this position for a reason that she probably didn't know at that time. And having Mordecai to be there to watch out for her was also providential. So God was at work. God was at work, even though they didn't realize it. Have you ever looked back and seen God's hand? Well, you might not have seen it going through it, but you look back and you say, yeah, that had to be God. Well, this is what was happening. So, if you recall, that happened several times in the Old Testament. If we look at Ezekiel, when he saw the valley of the dry bones, and God gave him a vision of those skeletons coming to life, and he was very discouraged, but he had that vision. Don't worry, I am working. Those bones will live again. And then Elijah, who was very lonely and had that spirit come to him, speaking in a still small voice, reminding him he wasn't alone. And then we have the promise in Romans 8:28. We know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. We have Jesus' promise that he will never leave us or forsake us. Now that one verse from Romans 8 gets misused sometimes. God causes all things to work together for good. God doesn't cause all things. Okay? There's a difference. God is not the author of disease. God is not the author of evil. God is not the author of so many things. Sometimes the author is Satan and the fact that we live in a broken world where disease happens. And who are we to be exempt from that? But sometimes things happen because we make choices that cause us to have consequences. And sometimes things just happen. God is not the author of those things, but so don't misuse this verse. God causes all things to work together for good. That's hard to think of when you're in the middle of having your son with a brain bleed in the ER. How can God use this for good? Okay? Think about that. So, God appears to be absent in the writing, but we know through happenings that he was not absent. Now, eventually we're going to see that there's this guy named Haman, and we'll talk more about this next week, who somehow manipulates the king into declaring that all the Jews are to be killed. And God has worked it out for Esther to be in the court and for Mordecai to have access to the court. In the meantime, God does something really interesting. Look at verse 19 of chapter 2. Now, when the virgins were being gathered together, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. He had to be a little bit important to be able to sit at the king's gate, because people came there and they were like judges that took care of civil disputes at the king's gate. So he was part of that. Now, Esther had not revealed her kindred or her people, as Mordecai had charged her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai, just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Ahasuerus. But the matter came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther. And Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, both the men were hanged on the gallows. This is important. It was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. So God used Mordecai to thwart an assassination attempt of the king. That's going to play a role as we proceed through this story. And it was also, once again, God positioning them to be in a place where he can work out his plan. So we have Mordecai in the good stead of the king, and we have Esther in the court. Now, she was one of a lot of wives, and she could not approach the king unless he asked for her. But he was very fond of her, and in the story, he ends up declaring that she is queen, and she becomes queen. But she shares her husband with probably 100 other women. But she was top of the heap. But still, she could only talk to him when he called for her. So that's the situation. So she was blessed with beauty, but we're going to learn that she also had a lot of brains to go with it, and she used them. When she found herself in this situation and down the road when Haman gets this bent to kill the Jews, she tells Mordecai, have our people pray fast for me, which is insinuating prayer because fasting and prayer go together. So there we know that she realizes there's something bigger than her, and she is leaning on her faith and the power of corporate prayer to help her to make whatever decision and choice she needs to make. So this is the prologue, or the leading up to what happens next week. And so I just want to take a minute to talk about providence and to give you an opportunity to just voice very briefly, for those of you who've seen God's providence in your life, what is one way or one time that you have looked back and seen providence, the providence of God in your life? Anybody willing to share? Anybody? Yes, Frank.
You know, when I was going down that hill on Ronald Reagan,
Yeah.
had I not hit that chocolate, I would have got hit by a car.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. So that very well could have been the providence
And that
of God.
car was going really fast.
Yeah. I'm glad you hit that chuck hole. Anybody else seen the providence of God at work in their lives? Yes, Rena?
I think it's providence that Caddy and I are here together.
Oh my gosh. Yes.
It's like, of all the things that could have ever happened in my life, to have someone who was my supervisor end up being one of my best friends here at church.
Yes, and to have Ketty meet Dennis, who's a dear friend of ours, and all their, it's just, it's providence.
6 degrees
You know,
of
and
separation.
yes, you know what when we say that's a God thing, we're really talking about providence. It's really providence. It's a God thing. When you look back and you say, oh my gosh, that's a God thing. What if I hadn't met that person? What if I hadn't made that choice? God is at work, and if you pray to the Lord to open your eyes to see those hands at work, and to trust that even when God seems silent or not around, that he is very much present and helping us get through what we need to get through and guiding us to where we're supposed to be next. Anybody else got any stories about the providence of God?
With Becky and her family, we worked at Walmart together, and
Yes.
they were kind of bad off for Christmas, and we went ahead and put their name on the gift basket
Mhm.
for Christmas and took things to them, and then she decided to come, and then Neil started
Yeah.
coming too, so it's grown, and
Yeah,
it's
the
still.
providence of God. Yes. Did you have something, Melanie?
Yeah, speaking of Walmart, I was actually thinking of maybe working out Walmart nearby where my grandma lives. Maybe it would actually be helping, because I've learned that people with autism actually more likely work there, and maybe you get a discount for helping
Yeah.
them.
You are going to find the place where you fit perfectly.
Yes.
Okay.
And that's also why, and also my sister thinks I should work on my temper for that.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, we could all use some work on our temper, Melanie.
Yes.
Yeah, we're going to pray that you find where you're supposed to fit, Melanie. Anybody? Eva?
I just mentioned this because I have a very dear friend named Esther,
Oh.
and she's a little
Yes.
older than me, and I known her since I was a teenager, and we met in a very odd way. We had lived in this house that my folks rented until we moved down to help, so my mom could care for her parents who were not well. And so the people that we had rented the house from, about 1/4 of a mile up the road, rented the house out, and they didn't really choose the best renters, but this person named Esther came out to babysit for them. I don't know if there was an ad in the paper or what. And the lady would just like not come home at night, and it was just sort of a mess. And she lived in Indianapolis, Esther did, and she couldn't get back home. It was like she was sort of captive. And so we took her home and got to know her, and we've been friends our whole life.
Wow. God's hand at work.
And also, concerning her, she had 2 children with her first marriage. Esther's a Christian, but later on, she got involved with a man, this is, of course, it's a long time ago, and became pregnant. And there was a period of time where I didn't really talk to her that much. Not that there was anything wrong, just, you sort of lose track of people.
Yeah.
And, but I had her phone number, and I went to the store or something one night, and I came home, and Bill said someone had called me, but he really didn't know who it was, and just it popped in my mind, well, maybe it was Esther.
Huh.
Well, I called Esther, and it wasn't her. However, she told me she was pregnant and was not married and was going to the hospital the next day either to get or see about an abortion. And I talked with her and explained all the ways they do those,
Mhm.
and I begged her, and her daughter now is 30-some. or
Wow. Let's
something.
talk about providence.
And
That God
the
put you
Lord
in the right
had me
place at the
call
wrong
her.
time.
It wasn't
At the right
her
time.
that called me.
Yeah.
And then I found that out, and we talked, and
Listen to that still small voice.
she changed her mind.
That's good. Listen to that nudge. If you're hearing something over and over and it keeps coming back, it may be God nudging
I
you.
don't remember this, but she said I cried on the phone.
Oh,
trying to
really?
talk her out of that, and so she changed her mind.
That's wonderful. What's her daughter's name?
Audrey.
Audrey. That's
Audrey
great.
Lynn.
So this is the beginning of the story, and if you want to hear the next episode, you have to come next week.